no-fly zone.
Thanks, Jim. And then what branch of service did you serve?
Air Force, and then in the Air National Guard. Air Force for 6.5 years, and Air National Guard for the balance of my career.
And your highest rank was what?
Highest rank was Major General.
Okay. What general locations did you serve during your service?
Active duty, I was in, after pilot training and upgrade training to the F-100, I served in Europe for 3 years, then was upgraded to the F-4 and went to Vietnam, and left the service for the Air National Guard in 1972. And served in the Air National Guard until 2006. And then in the Air National Guard, we have deployed to, like I said, the Balkans, to the Southwest Asia. Had deployments over to the Pacific, as far as Hawaii, not any farther than that.
If we go way back in time now, can you tell me what made you join the military, or what led up to the point where you joined the military?
Well, I went to what was considered a land-grant school, and you had to be a member of ROTC in your freshman year. And in talking to fellow students, I had one particular student that was all set to go and fly airplanes for the Air Force. It was Air Force ROTC, and he convinced me that maybe I should look at ROTC as a 4-year program rather than a 1-year program. And I did, and made a commitment. And after your sophomore year, you make a commitment to a commissioning, and they actually give you some stipends along the way. So you start owing them a commitment in the Air Force at that point.
And then that led to, after graduation in college, was it?
Well, that was in college. And so what happened, and I had no particular interest in the military. I don't come from a military family, but and certainly didn't have any particular interest in flying. But in summer camp, between your junior and senior year, I was able to fly in a fighter-type airplane in the back seat, just as a rider and a passenger. And from that point on, I kind of fell in love with flying. And actually, that and another flight at that summer camp was the first time I'd ever been off the ground. I grew up in a farm family, so I don't have most of those people that raised food didn't serve in the wars, and in World War II or Korea. They were there they got deferments. So that's kind of how it all evolved. So I was hooked on flying, and then decided to.
Did you go immediately after graduating from college into
Right.
the military then? And,
yes, you get out of ROTC, you get a commission. They always there was a gap in there. Normally, for an ROTC graduate in the spring, you normally get your pilot training or your first active duty assignment. You're in a reserve status, and then you get your active duty assignment normally in the fall of the same year. And some would go later than that. So it could be you could have up to a year off, in a reserve status, non-drilling status. But in my case, I started pilot training in October after graduating in June.
Of which year was that again?
June of my commissioning date was 3 June of 1966,
Okay.
and I started pilot training the beginning of October in 1966.
Do you recall where your first assignment was?
Yes, there at the time, of course, the build-up for Vietnam had been going on for a couple of years. They actually were in the process of expanding training bases, and I think we got up to as many as 10 training bases during that period. At the time, there were 9, and I went to Selma, Alabama, which was interesting in and of itself, coming from a Northeast farm community, and that was a year after the Selma marches and all that civil rights stuff that went on in Selma. Was an interesting dynamic that I hadn't ever had to face or deal with. So we pretty much didn't assign minorities to Selma during that period for obvious reasons, because downtown just wasn't a place for them, and unfortunately. And so we were able to, and in that regard, I mean, the military is just a microcosm of society, so we had to deal with all those issues. And during Vietnam, we had some real racial issues that we had to deal with, and I think we've overcome them all as well as anybody.
So you then ended up, your flight training began when you got to Selma?
Yes,
at that base.
October, it's a year of training. You go through a primary aircraft, a T-37, and then an advanced airplane, a T-38, which was a supersonic trainer. And then you got your pilot's wings at the end of that year, and then you got your assignment. So the key to pilot training was that was probably the only time in your career you're going to get your choice if you were the top of the class. And I was fortunate enough to be. There was only one pilot ahead of me in the class, and he had a guard assignment, which was I didn't even have to compete with him for whatever the assignment was that night. So I got my first choice, and that was an F-100 single seat fighter pilot.
Was that also training done there, or did you go somewhere else for that training?
No. Once you had your assignment, you went off to a replacement training unit, an RTU, and mine was in Luke Air Force Base, Phoenix, Arizona. I went there for 6 months, and that was the fighter courses were about 6 months. The bomber or the cargo airplanes, which you started out in the right seat, were much shorter. They'd do about a 2.5 month course, and then they'd be at their operational assignment. So we left pilot training. I thought I was pipelined to Vietnam because Vietnam was rated coming into the height of Vietnam, and for reasons of personnel shortages in Europe, I ended up going to Europe first. But that 6 months terminated. I had to go to survival school, Siri training.
Where were those done?
Survival. Once I was done with the training in Phoenix, I went to Fairchild Air Force Base up in Spokane, Washington. Out into the woods for 3 weeks. Well, week of academics and 2 weeks in the woods, prisoner of war camp, all those enhanced interrogation stuff you talk about.
At that age, did you find that interesting, or?
I kind of thought after that, if they ever make me do this again, I'd probably quit flying. They take you right up to and including, put you under a lot of stress and try to simulate a prisoner of war situation. And obviously, we didn't go to the same level, I'm sure, as I wasn't waterboarded, but everything up to that probably. And I'm not so sure that special forces, they don't waterboard them. Yeah. But that was survival training. That was it was interesting, but I never wanted to do it again for sure.
And the other training, you mentioned two things. There was another acronym there that as far as
Siri. Survival, escape and evasion.
So escape and evasion course. Okay.
It's the stuff that came to light. Well, it was mentioned when we talked about enhanced interrogation coming out of the recent wars, and then Siri was brought up as something we do to our own troops, right, just to prepare them for that worst case scenario.
Right.
So that's all it was. And then from there, I hopped on a charter airplane and went to England and to RAF Wethersfield to fly F-100s. And primary mission in Europe at the time was nuclear deterrence. So we set strip alert was our main mission. We trained for conventional war as well, but the primary thing was to kind of stand off against the Russians across the Iron Curtain with fighters and missiles and whatever.
Do you recall much of that time you spent in England?
Oh well, it's we would deploy forward from England to. We were TDY, or away from home, at least a month out of every quarter. And being a bachelor at the time, I actually volunteered for extra deployments. So I think the first year I was there, I wasn't in England more than half the year, and the other half was either in Aviano, Italy, which is in northern Italy, sitting alert against targets in the southern satellite countries, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, those countries, which were under communist control at the time. And then in Turkey, Izmir, Turkey, which is on the west coast, the Mediterranean coast. And most of those targets were in the Crimea area. And then out of home station, we sat against targets, mostly East Germany and Prague, were our targets. And we never launched. It was one of those things that was very highly controlled. You had to study your target. It was a very intense training regiment to be what we called a bomb commander. And that meant you were in command of the nuke that you were sitting on, and the authentications, all those kind of things, and the systems of controls, many levels of controls, was an interesting era.
How long were you stationed?
3 years.
3 years. So that would have been from 19.
1960. Went in the summer of '67, and I served till 70, spring of '71.
And then your next assignment from there was?
After that, I was sent back to George Air Force Base. I had orders to go to Phuket, Vietnam, F4 unit there. And so because I was already been trained as a fighter pilot, they gave me what they called a Cat 4 checkout, which was very unusual at the time. But they didn't feel they needed to give me any more than 1 month in the airplane. I flew with an instructor every ride, and I had a grand total of 25 hours going into combat in a brand new weapon system. So getting, but the difference was that when as I got there, we went through the Philippines. We had to do a week of jungle survival, which was mostly academics, and one overnight in the jungle. And I guess the interesting dynamic there was you really brought home that, man, if I was sitting in a North Vietnam jungle, I'd be really concerned right now. So those are the kind of things that go through your head when you're not flying. When you're flying, you don't think about those things. But when you're not flying, you think about those consequences. So I eventually showed up at Phuket. They told me my orders were changed. I told them I'll be down tomorrow to pick them up, and because the orders they were changed to was Thailand. And the difference between serving in Vietnam and Thailand is when you're not over flying the enemy territories and flying in combat, you're in a basically non-combat environment. But you can go downtown, you go to Bangkok. And so that was living a lot better for a year in Vietnam. In Vietnam itself. So I ended up at Ubon, Thailand, with the 8th Fighter Wing. And that was the Wolf Pack. That was Robin Olds' wing when they were shooting down all the airplanes in the Rolling Thunder, the early part of the war. And then my service period there was a bombing halt put in place by Johnson in 1968. And in hopes that they would come to the peace table. Obviously, I don't think it worked, and I think it might have worked against us. But so we weren't going to bomb North Vietnam, and the leadership, the military, felt that we could stem the flow of supplies that came down a jungle trail through Laos, called the Steel Tiger, the eastern part of Laos, down through into South Vietnam. A lot of it came in through the demilitarized zone up north, Khe Sanh area. A lot of it went all the way down to the Parrots Peak, which was near Saigon, and they could hide in the jungle. And our leadership felt that we could stop them with interdiction fighters and primary gunships, C-130 gunships. So that was the period I served in. And so we had North Vietnam missions, but they were very infrequent. And it was just to kind of, I guess, set the tone, tell them, hey, we're still here. We can still come up there and impact in the north. And I never went north of the Than Hoa Bridge, which was south of Haiphong. So that's as far north as we went. And then subsequent to my tour, they did start Linebacker, and that's where the war kind of ended. They did start bombing Hanoi, Haiphong again with B-52, up to and including B-52. So that kind of really brought them to the peace table. But we were trying to stop the trucks, not in truck parks up in the north, but find them in a dirt trail in a Mach 2 fighter.
If you go back to when you first arrived in Thailand, which was really your first time in country, I guess we call it, overseas, do you recall the first few days, what it felt like as someone that hadn't been in that environment before?
Well, I realized two things. I thought, I knew enough about flying the F-4, but the mission we had in Thailand, they were, at Ubon particularly, they were trying to develop conventional weaponry to the next level. And if you recall Desert Storm and all the precision ordnance, and now it's all precision engagement with GPS bombs. We actually had the first laser bombs. We had systems on the airplane, a Loran system with a computer release system. We had people lasing from gunships to forward air controllers and OV-10s. We didn't do it with anybody on the ground, which they do now if they use the laser, but Now it's mostly the GPS bombs they use. But so it was very interesting. We were kind of all the conventional weaponry normally is developed at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, and we called ourselves Eglin East because we were the ones that tried to employ it in realistic conditions and see if this stuff really works. And some systems were very good. Some systems you knew going in that we test them, but said this just isn't going to work, and they didn't. But they were trying to upgrade our conventional capability, which actually served us very well, especially in Desert Storm, and some later conflicts, because we certainly came a long ways in Vietnam in developing our conventional capabilities, because it was pretty much all new in the main part of the Cold War, the 50s into the early 60s. So, and we were right at the heart of that, and a lot of engineering tech reps over there, discussing these programs with us. And I was able to get in on testing two systems. One was with a gunship lasing for us, and us with the laser guided bombs, and they worked because in the gunship you could, on the trail you could see the 40 millimeter HEI exploding like sparkle. So you always knew where the secret to the system was, knowing where the energy is. You can't see a laser beam, and you can't see the energy, but we knew the energy was bore sighted to the 40 millimeter, so we'd never miss, because the bomb would always see the energy and home in on it. If you're trying to have a forward air controller brief you, or somebody in another airplane that's got a laser in the back seat of the airplane, F4, if you don't get on the same target, the bomb will probably never see the energy, because you got to get it into a cone, a basket, to get it to see the energy.
Did you fly as is it a single-seater aircraft?
No, two-seater. No, we had back-seaters. We had the F4 at the time basically replaced the F-100 as the all-purpose fighter in the Air Force. And basically the F-100s were coming out of service at the time. And this was in 71. And the F-4 was a predominant fighter. And it could do everything. It did air-to-air. Most of that mission was done at another base in Thailand. A lot of the close air support for the Army, if the F Force was going to do it, was done out of Cam Ranh or Phuket. And we had the special weapons, and it was mostly interdiction. And I was in a night squadron, and the most challenging mission that we flew was night armed recce. And what I mean is we were armed with cluster bomb units, we had flares, we had some rockets, and we could also, because we were qualified as forward air controllers, we could actually put strike airplanes in. But at night under flare light, the key was just getting out of the way for that guy and trying to get him a target. And it was just the most effective we could be was to stay in the choke points. There was two choke points coming out of North Vietnam, Magia Pass and Bang Karai Pass. There was another pass down by the DMZ, but it was very rugged. But those passes were where most of the trucks came out of North Vietnam, where we weren't bombing, into the trail. And then it branched out from there, but those were the choke points. But because they were choke points, they were very highly defended with 37 millimeter, some 23, but mostly 37, 57. And it was like the 4th of July every night with tracers. I mean, it was just, if you recall pictures of Baghdad during Desert Storm, that's what it looked like every night. And every once in a while, they bring a SAM, but a SAM site has to be engineered and set up properly, and that was mostly to fire for effect. They would fire SA-2s every once in a while from North Vietnam, but they were hesitant to do that. They knew the ROE as well as we did, the North Vietnamese, and they were probably a little reticent to fire from North Vietnam, because then we could call a protective reaction and go drop our bombs on the truck park up there. So it was cat and mouse game over a dirt trail is what it was. And we tried to stem the tide of traffic coming through those passes. So as they branched out, then we kind of hand them off to the gunships. And the other mission we did primarily at night and this was all at night. They always traveled at night, hardly ever traveled in daytime, because we had fast facts called like we were an owl fact or a night fact, and the day facts would be up there, and they could see the traffic in the daytime and attack it. So truck traffic really picked up at night under the cover of darkness. And then our gunships that were developed again, conventional weapon system that now is flown by special ops, very effective system for special ops in the Army to this day. They were very effective at finding the trucks with all the sensors, IR, EO sensors, and bore-sighted 40 millimeter gun at the time. Eventually got a 105 howitzer put on the airplane, which was a big round, could do a lot of damage, and they could really focus in on that truck and hit it with that system. And it was in orbit, and so we would escort them because they'd be firing at them too. And there were some other points on the trail that were kind of were choke points, so they could be heavily defended. And the gunships, if there's any radar associated with the bigger guns, they could really hone in on the gunships. They're slow. They're as at night. They can't see them. They couldn't see us. We're all lights out. But if they had any radar with them, then they could. So mostly it was just barrage fire, and we would drop CBUs in the position of the gun to try to suppress that fire.
What would a CBU be?
Cluster bomb unit,
okay.
Which was just a bunch of hand grenade-sized bomblets that come out of a canister, and so it covers a couple football field pattern. So, and it's just cat and mouse thing. They'd harass the gunships, and if the gunships got nervous, they'd break orbit, and then they're not looking for trucks. We'd harass them to keep them from shooting too much. And if we came close enough to them, they might shut down for a while and say it's not a night to be shooting because they got our location located. And it gave the gunships some confidence that somebody was harassing the guns that was harassing them. And that's kind of the way the war was going at the time. So we were right in the middle of it, and it was trying to stem the flow of troops and supply from North Vietnam. And of course, at the time, and there was a big North Vietnamese operation in 1972, right after I left. It was bringing troops and supplies down into the Cambodian, Laotian border area, and then to try to attack cities and units supporting Viet Cong. But the Viet Cong was pretty much decimated by Tet, and pretty much it was going to be a North Vietnamese fight from then on.
When you were receiving fire on these night missions, were there techniques to avoid being hit, or was it just luck or lack of luck?
No, the technique was to go fast. They had to shoot a sound, and if you're going fast enough, they had been there for years, as we called them. There's levels of expertise and maintenance in the military called 1 to 9 level. And they definitely were all 9 level gunners, meaning they were good. And at night, lights out, they had to shoot at sound, and we wanted as dark a night as we could get because although on some moonlit nights it was easier to find a reference point to put the flare out. The darker it was, the less likely they would see us in the moonlight or any kind of shadow, but through the moon. And we always position ourselves away from the moon, just as opposed to the sun. You want to come out of the sun in the daytime. We want to not be in the moon.
How fast is fast in an F4?
450 to 500 knots. And normally, if you were going fast enough, and if you made repeated passes on the same target, and they started guessing, because they're kind of guessing where you're going to be, and then it's a barrage of AAA that they hope that you will fly through, just like in kind of World War II. So not really aimed. It was always over the road, but they knew there's a flare out there. And they knew you're going to come back to look at it or attack something underneath it. So they knew where they wanted to shoot. It's just a matter of when coordinate it with your presence there over that flare, either to look at it or attack a target. So it was a guessing game on their part, a little bit of a guessing game on our part to try to fool them. So I'd say there's probably 3 times, I flew 200 missions, probably 55 of these armed recce missions. And I can only really recall a couple times where they guessed right. And then it's just the big sky concept. Little bullet, big sky. You know, if everything missed you. And there was a couple times where it was just, there's tracers all around. But a lot of times they're behind you, or they're shooting too soon. And if they're shooting out in front of you, you just broke off the pass. So I'm not going to take a look this time. I'm going to break off the attack. And You just didn't fly through the AAA.
How could you visually see at 500 knots and you say you have a
You
flare out
didn't.
to give light, but
You didn't. You hoped what you did. You had flares out. If you saw something, all they had to do was get off the trail. The trail was open. It had been bombed enough. There was no canopy over it. You could see the main pass roads that came down out of McGee and Bankerack. But so if you got over it under flare and there's a truck, it's a shadow on the road. And you could see it. It was fairly easy to pick up. But most of the time you go across, there's nothing there. And there could be trucks there, but they're off under the canopy. And so you don't see them. But they're not moving. So it's an harassment type thing. You slow them down enough. And so we always had to justify to the higher headquarters, well, you're not getting any bomb damage assessment. You're not killing anything. I said, well, I don't know that that's really our purpose. It's if we can slow enough traffic down and just harass them enough and keep it at a pace that the gunships now hopefully can pick them off as they get down farther in the trail where it's less defended. The gunships couldn't have survived in that because that barrage fire. I mean, there was in those two passes there was together 100 plus guns, right in a concentrated area. And they just wouldn't survive that for repeated orbits over that. So they would only work from certain points south of the pass. South, they wouldn't work in those passes. So it was us just trying to slow it down. So it wasn't really, and that was again, that was the armed recce forward air control mission that we flew. We flew the gunship escort, and that was just always having that 4 over his orbit. And he had lights on top of his wings, so you could track him from the top. Nobody could see him from the ground. And if somebody shot at him, you'd roll in and drop a cluster bomb unit just to let them know you're thinking about them. And hopefully that would cut down the AAA, and the gunship could stay in the orbit. Because if he didn't orbit, he couldn't attack. He had to orbit. And then the wet season, which was from the pretty much from May all the way through to November, was the monsoon season. And it was a dirt mud trail. There was a mud trail in the wet season. There was a dirt trail in the dry season. So that really stopped the flow of traffic more than we did in the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So we had some interdiction targets sometimes that give us some targets in North Vietnam during those periods. It was politically tenable, I guess, to the leadership of the country that, okay, we want to go up and let them know we're still here.
Was it obvious during time when you could do what politically there or not?
No.
Or it was about constant during the period of time you were there?
There were decisions that were made at obviously the highest political level. A lot of that happened really in my tour, at the end of my tour. And it was a time period where the Vietnamese weren't negotiating seriously. And so they, every once in a while, they say, okay, let's just twist our arm a little, and we'd go up and there were some big supply areas, in port area at Dong Hoi, which was right north of the demilitarized zone, all the way up to the Than Hoa Bridge was a choke point up south of Hanoi Haiphong, where all the supplies had to pretty much go across the Red River at the Than Hoa Bridge. And we actually attacked that one time when they decided, okay, we're going to show the capability, and that would have, and we were weathered out on it. But subsequently, that bridge was attacked during Rolling Thunder with dumb bombs forever, with very little effect. By the time they got the linebacker with the precision bombs we had, it went in the river pretty quickly and was kept in the river on a pretty constant basis. And linebacker 1 was the spring of '72, right after I left. Linebacker 2 was the Christmas bombing in '72, and that's what really brought him to the peace table. And that's when the B-52s were making multiple strikes and pretty much carpet bombing military targets, but you're still going to have some collateral damage. But the precision capability of putting those, the problem with a bridge is that if you don't hit it, you missed it completely because these are over gorges, so there's no damage unless you hit the span. And hit a bridge from an airplane moving at 500 knots is difficult, to say the least, but with the laser bomb, it hit the laser energy. So So that's kind of the way it evolved after I left. And, so we were flying a lot of those missions up north. We did it we went against a supply depot known as Bat Lake. It was a lake up at the head of the Bankerai Pass, at a bunch of caves, and they were hiding supplies in there. So we were going to go in and just kind of carpet bomb it with F-4s. And that was in December of 71. And we thought it was interesting because we had this Loran system, which was a computerized Loran positioned the airplane. We had a computerized bombing system off it. And our squadron was one of the only ones that had this system. And it worked very well if you had good time delays. It worked off radio signals from a master and slave station. You had to have good time delays. And the leadership of 7th Air Force, of the Air Force, said we're going to be able to hit this target because we think we got the right numbers on it. So we went in there, and the weather was bad. It was undercast, so we couldn't see the target. So we bombed for 3 days, and we were leading all the flights. And it got all done. Weather cleared, and we were about 5 miles off.
Yeah.
Weren't even close. so of course, you knew what happened then. It's the pilot's fault. It was our squadron. So the IG comes down, and the headquarters, and says, "Okay." And fortunately, our squadron knew enough we kept all the numbers. So we were able to show them that, no, it's your numbers that are bad. It wasn't, our bombs hit were the numbers you gave us. And why do you think they all hit in one spot? It's because we bombed the place you gave us, but it wasn't the right place. So you haven't revolutionized warfare just yet. And of course, nowadays, if we can, with a GPS bomb, if you got a good, and that's better than Loran, because it works off coordinates. And if you got and we got great satellite coverage, you can come within 30 feet just by putting that coordinate and bombing through the weather. So that's what it's evolved to. So you go all the way back to the early 70s. I mean, we're talking about 71. We had developed precision engagement, not to the level we have it now, but we were certainly in the initial phases of developing that capability for the U.S. military. And certainly, if you don't have precision engagement today, you don't go to war. So that's.
I mean, you said it was 5 miles off, but I mean, there must have been successes where you could be much more accurate.
Well, the 5 miles off was because the numbers were wrong.
When you say numbers, do you mean they're obviously not coordinates, or were they?
Well, they have coordinates. They have the position of their radio stations, because Loran works off radio waves. You got a slave station, you got a master station, you might have a couple of slave stations, and then the system here is this signal, and it's a time delay. So it's transmitted, and the Loran measures, okay, that took this much time to get to me from the two stations, and that fixes your position. And it's a shipping type of system. The ships, we have Loran stations all along the coast, and ships determine their position, but it doesn't have to be for a ship. It can be within a couple miles is fine, but for a bomb, and it's positioning it was positioning the airplane, not the bomb. But the trajectory of the bomb, all the ballistics were in the computer, and if you ended up releasing the bomb at the proper point, and they could read wind, they could read drift, and all that stuff, because it's constantly getting these radio signals. So it's measuring time delays. How far is it from these stations by time of the radio signal? So they had the wrong, we call them TDs, time delays. They gave us the wrong TDs we put in the machine, is what they did. But because they didn't believe it initially, they thought we had screwed it up. And we proved to them, no, here's our data. And we had to, in the system would give us data out of the system. Here's how you did, how close you were to where the bomb should have gone based on the numbers you put in.
Sure. And
we didn't have anybody that was more than 20 feet to 30 feet off on the numbers that came out of our F-4 cockpit. So here they are, General. I was a captain at the time. So did
they send you back into?
we did not go back in. We went in there. We did go back into Bat Lake, and it wasn't with Loran though. It was with conventional, with the laser guided bombs. And I didn't go on that mission because that was a daytime mission. We were still flying the night mission at the time, so I did not go on that mission. Actually, they actually lost 2 airplanes in that mission, and so it's fairly heavily defended. And they had two crews, and both of them were repatriated. They were both POWs for obviously during that period. They wasn't more than a year and a half at that point. And obviously, there was McCain and a lot of the other ones spent a lot longer than that up there. And of course, they were all in prison at the time we were over there. All the POWs. And that was the other goal was the peace with honor, whatever that meant, and then making sure part of that was to get the POWs back. So we certainly as pilots agreed with that. Let's try to do whatever we can to end this thing and get it over with. Weren't quite sure about the strategy, but that wasn't our decision to make as captains, young fighter pilots. We just did what we were told. And so obviously we felt that if you want to get this thing over with, we need to go back into North Vietnam, where the trucks start from, not wait until they get to a dirt trail. Try to slow them down. But that was all part of the political decisions and trying to get the peace talks started and all that. So, well above my level.
What was day-to-day life like when you weren't flying?
Oh, it was great. It was, we went in the dry season from November all the way through, and I left in March, the spring of '72. So I left right in the dry season was pretty much coming to an end in March, but it went into April, May. But we pretty much flew every day. You were busy. But at night, you could go downtown. The name of the community was Ubal Ratchathani. It was kind of in the triangle of Cambodia, Laos, fairly close to the Mekong River, to the Laotian border, but not too dangerous. Actually, there was it wasn't but a 2-hour. You get a cab from downtown to go down to Angkor Wat when I first got there. Now they shut that border off. And we had some missions into Cambodia, which weren't publicized, at the time. So there was a couple of incursions in there, and that happened periodically because they thought supplies were being stored there too. So when we weren't supposed to. Well, we weren't at war with Laos, but it was fairly well known that we're dropping bombs on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Not so much in Cambodia, but try to go and destroy supplies, destroy enemy concentrations in those countries that were just waiting on the other side of the border to attack our formations in South Vietnam or South Vietnamese Army formations at that time. It was pretty much a South Vietnamese Army issue or fight at that time. We pretty much brought out all the American forces. Few advisors still in there. So the action was to try to just stem the tide of supplies come down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Obviously, there was MiGs in North Vietnam. They'd make incursions into the Laos to drive the gunships out because the gunships were very effective, and they certainly weren't. They certainly were susceptible to a MiG attack. We weren't as F4s. We could pick them up on radar and defend ourselves more than adequately. But the gunships would leave. Any surface-to-air missile, radar-guided missile was a huge threat to the gunships. So that would also, if they brought one of those down, a lot of them they did bring down fire for effect. I felt because a lot of them I saw didn't guide; they just went up, and never nosed over. They just went up straight up and blew up at 40,000 feet.
How did you prevent or
Well, if we saw SAM, we had ECM, so did the gunships, and that could spoof the SAM. It would give indications to the SAM radar that we were a different place than what we really were. Electronic countermeasures, basically. Yeah. And then if it started to get close, we had chaff, which was aluminum strips that you could put out. And it might home in on that. It would come out as a big plume on the radar, and as opposed to us as a F4. And obviously, the target chaff is slowing down, so it might bite on the chaff. So we had those kind of countermeasures, as did the gunships. But the gunships were so slow and we could outmaneuver Sam. Sam couldn't. All you had to do is see it. You could just outturn it.
Was it easy to see?
Well, at night it was. At night you couldn't miss it. It was a big bottle rocket, huge. And Sam is 20, 30 feet long. It's the big rocket.
Do you
just
see it on
just like a launch of a small missile.
Sure.
You know?
Do you see it in electronics as well, though, like on a radar screen?
Yes,
or is there
yes.
like that, or?
We had raw gear, which is radar homing and warning, in the airplane. And if the radar, if they put a radar on you, if it would be a strobe on a scope, and then you had a signal in your headset. It sounded like a rattlesnake, and it depended on how well we call it PRF, and that was a pulse radar frequency. If it was a high frequency, it would be rattling a lot higher frequency than it was low. The low frequency was the acquisition. The high frequency was tracking. So once they were tracking, then you better be looking, because if it's tracking, there's a missile airborne. So you could go through that sequence and see it, but at night you could see it.
You'd see it without that.
Right. In the daytime, you'd have to depend on that a little bit.
Sure.
And one of the things they started doing, there's also, they could sweep us with GCI, which is just ground control intercept radar, just to kind of position you. And they actually got to the point where they got pretty good at, in North Vietnam, launching the missile, just sweeping you with a GCI, so you just said, well, they're just looking at me. You always had that looking at you from north. So you weren't too concerned about it, because there weren't any MiGs up. And we had airplanes up that were tracking the MiGs. They were listening to frequencies on the ground. There were EC-121s that sat in orbit, and they could hear when the MiGs were scrambling by radio calls, and then they had they had radar on the bases, so they could tell when the MiGs were going to launch. But so you weren't too concerned about the GCI. So not being concerned about it, well, what happened was they get that missile pointed the right direction, and they wouldn't turn on the acquisition radar. And they actually shot down an F4 over the trail one night, and nobody could figure it out, because this guy was actually a Weasel F4, which is supposed to be the anti-radiation, the guy that would go attack these SAMs. How can this guy have missed this? He's got better equipment than we do. Well, I found out that he got no warning. He turned the tracking radar on, and the missile was already there, and picked up the tracking to the target without any acquisition. So it didn't go through the sequence of that, is what it didn't. So they actually, and that's what I was talking about earlier, we were discussing some of the things that happened politically in Vietnam, where that was the thing that changed the whole ROE. If they tracked us with radar, we could then also call a protective reaction strike. They didn't necessarily have to fire it at us. They just had to get to a certain level of tracking us with the radar, and we could say, okay. And you'd have to get permission to get a protective reaction. So we were able to defend ourselves. And normally those were, if you asked for one, they were approved.
Yeah. And
then you'd go after whatever the threat was, or whatever was there. And that was for North Vietnam, which we weren't supposed to bomb unless they shot at us from North Vietnam.
And then in South Vietnam, you could do
South
anything you'd like to.
South Vietnam, I only flew one mission my whole time in South Vietnam, and those were close air support missions. We just never, because of we had the interdiction bombs for the trail and for North Vietnam, so we just didn't have. They would use the F4s in South Vietnam that had general purpose bombs, and they wouldn't task us with that mission because we were just busy doing other stuff. So I don't. Actually, the close air support mission, which I flew, it might have been with the Laotians. It might not even been with the Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese. It just wasn't something we would ever do.
Sure.
Because of the missions we had. The air-to-air guys at UDOR would probably never do it, because they were the MiG cap. The guys went up and protected the bombers that were bombing the trail, and they were up every night in a cap, combat air patrol. just in case the MiGs came up. And so that was their mission primarily. And they also bombed. So everybody did a little. The F-4 was a general purpose fighter. It could be air superiority, basically air defense against the MiGs. It could be interdiction. It could do close air support. But it do it as well as the F-100s had done it prior to, because that's all they did. Probably not, because they hadn't. When you're doing multiple missions, you're kind of a jack of all trades, master of none. So you have to kind of divide your attention between all these diverse missions. So our mission was basically interdiction. The air-to-air guys were UDORN, and the close air support was pretty much the Cameron, Da Nang, F-4s. So we didn't cross over that much. So you kind of specialized. So the airplane was capable of doing it all, but obviously the close air support, the Army preferred helicopters and gunships and other stuff to the F-4.
When you at what point did you leave the duty in Thailand then?
I left in March of '72. Linebacker actually started in April of '72, the spring offensive against the North Vietnamese, and the final one that really brought the peace about in early '73 was the Christmas bombing of '72, and that was with B-52s. So, but I left in March of '72. Came back to Mountain Home, Idaho. I had a commitment out of my upgrade training, so I had another year to do in the Air Force. But at the time, they had what was known as a program to exchange your commitment for a guard commitment. The Air Force at the time was in a downsizing cycle because of they saw the end of Vietnam coming. They had put all the F-100s into the Air National Guard, some to the Boneyard. F-4s are going to be the primary fighter. F-100s are not going to be in the Air Force anymore. So fewer and fewer cockpits. So they came up with a program that if you were going to school full time, or you got into a Guard or Reserve unit, you could give up that commitment for a 2-year commitment. 2 times commitment in the Guard, and then you'd have a same thing if you went to school. You'd still be in an inactive reserve status for whatever. If you had say a 3-year commitment left, enlisted guys could do it, officers could do it. If you had a 3-year commitment left, you had a 6-year reserve commitment, or either active in the Guard or in reserve, or just an inactive status. And those were the two. I think those were the 2 things you could do to exchange that commitment in the Air Force for becoming a civilian, basically. So I became a civilian in the fall of '72, August, I think. August, September area, '72. Left the active duty, left Mountain Home, and Palace chased into the Air National Guard in Connecticut. And they were flying 100s, which I had flown in Europe. So I came back. I lived in my hometown in upstate New York. Became a banker for a couple of years, and was what we call a traditional pilot, a part-time pilot. So I kept my flying skills at a certain level. And it was kind of a strategic reserve level. You know, you're capable of flying the airplane safely. You're really not all that trained to go to war immediately, type of status. And did that for 2 years, and then got a full-time job in the Guard in August of '74.
In Connecticut, still the same unit?
Connecticut, same unit. And certainly always wanted to fly, and flying part-time wasn't a bad gig, but knew that I was commuting a long ways. If I was going to become a banker, and a serious banker, I'd probably have to give up some of the flying. So decided banking wasn't as neat a thing to do as keep flying F-100s. So once I was offered the full-time job, at the time the government paid a lot more for instructor pilots in the Guard than they paid bankers. So it was not much of a.
Was that your duty when you were then full-time again, or did you have an assignment that was different than just flying?
No, I was what they call the flying training instructor. I gave all the check rides, made sure you upgraded all the pilots in the unit, make sure you kept them as current as you could, met all the requirements based on the training that we were required to do. Of course, that was a period where military was going through some tough times post-Vietnam. Military wasn't well thought of. I mean, the wasn't well funded, especially the Guard and Reserve, and so somewhat of a what they call a hollow force. And even an active duty, they had some real limitations on training time, money for training. And of course, we were transitioning from a draft force to an all-volunteer force that came into being in 1973, I think, or 4. So that was a tough time culturally for the Guard, for the active duty, for all of us. But we made it through it, and by the time President Reagan got in, and he really infused a lot of money into the military to try to stand up to what the perceived threat was, which was back to the Cold War threat. And obviously the results of that seemed to work. And the big thing that happened to the Air Guard culturally for us was that it changed our outlook from on how we had to train and the level we had to train to, because we were given frontline fighters. We were given the A-10 in 1979. So it wasn't we now had an airplane that was flown by our active component, not an airplane that was headed for the boneyard, the 100. So they were going to invest time and money into our operations, which meant full-time manpower and some money. And we became a ready reserve as opposed to a strategic reserve. So our requirements on our pilots went up substantially. The culture had to change in the unit. A lot of people would leave because they said, I didn't sign up for this much activity.
Was the F-100 still an aircraft in that unit at that time,
No,
or it all went over to the A-10s?
All went to the A-10s. The F-100 went out of the inventory completely in 1979. We were one of the last units that flew the 100. And most of the, if you look at Vietnam, the only airplanes that were called up from the Guard and Reserve in Vietnam, well, it was just a Guard, was flying fighters, was the airplanes that the Air Force was flying. And the only airplanes the Guard was flying, the Air Force was flying, was some reconnaissance F-4s, a couple of units, and then F-100 units. Anything that the Air Force wasn't flying didn't get called. So we certainly realized in reserve component, and I'm sure the Army Guard realizes it now, if they don't have common equipment, they're not a ready reserve, and they won't be funded properly. If they are, it's a very inexpensive way to take advantage of some pretty expensively bought training in a reserve status. And so you got to have the right mix of reserve forces and active forces to make it work. So that's a whole nother discussion area that you probably don't want to get into, but that was an interesting time. I mean, going from the kind of the draft environment, the lifers versus the guy that was just there because he had to be there, to everybody was a lifer by the time we really inculcated the volunteer culture. And that was a huge transition in my mind, how we looked at things in the military. And we became a lot more professional. And then, of course, and it was pretty much a stay-at-home garrison force for the 80s. I mean, we weren't engaged in the conflict. The bad guys were the Russians. And of course, we did the best we could to undermine them, like they did the best they could to undermine us during Vietnam. And so it was that, again, that cat and mouse game. And then eventually they crumbled. They couldn't keep up with us militarily.
Were you, when you were stationed with the A-10s and the Connecticut Guard, is that something the Air Guard, did you have any deployments overseas during that period of time?
Yeah, we
did they activate?
Right. Once we became what we call total force, a ready reserve, we deployed to Europe twice. Went to I actually went back to Wethersfield, the base I served at. It was under caretaker status. There wasn't any airplanes there, but it was a base that we would fall in on if World War III broke out, the Cold War. We would deploy there, and we trained. We got intel briefings. We were trained up on that theater, and it was a training program called Checkered Flag. And so we deployed twice, and the second time we deployed was the base we were going to go to was Nordholz, was a German anti-submarine base. They flew the Atlantic, which was like the P-3 sub chasers that we flew in the Navy. But they would host us if we ever during that. That was the second half of the '80s, and then our checkered flag base became Korea. South Korea is where we're going to be based, and so we basically our whole training focus was on that base. So we were the first ones in if war broke out. Now you had notional tasking to be trained in all theaters, your basic stuff, but we primarily concentrated on the intel reports out of Korea at that time. So that was kind of what evolved through the '80s for us as a unit. And so we deployed to all those bases. We were ready to deploy to Korea, but they ran short of money, which was not a bad deal for us because instead of going all the way to Korea, we only went halfway to Hawaii. And we supported the 25th Division in Hawaii. And it was a program called Opportune Journey, and it was a plan to put air support in for the Army that was there all things. There's no air support permanently stationed there, so they'd rotate units in. So we spent a month in Hawaii training with the 25th Division.
Did you find that to be your most difficult deployment then?
Oh, yes. Actually, Kilauea, and I don't know if I have the right volcano, but if you remember in 1983, that erupted. Huge spews of lava coming out of the ground in the big island, Hawaii. That was our range we used. That's where we dropped. We were dropping live bombs there. So I wasn't too concerned about it, but.
Did you fly your aircraft there, or did you arrive and fly someone else's aircraft?
In the Air Force, you always flew your airplanes there with tankers. All the fighters in the Air Force are air refuelable, air-to-air refuelable. So, and that was one of the things about going to Korea. It would have been a whole week's operation. It would have been four different legs: West Coast, Hawaii, Midway, Korea. By only going to Hawaii, it was close to 3 days, because they give you a day off in between legs, or at least 16 hours of crew rest. It was to the West Coast and then into Hawaii.
Is the A-10 a single pilot aircraft?
Single pilot airplane. Strapped in. The deployments to Europe, going that way to Europe was normally around the 7 to 8 hours, and got to the point that if we had any headwinds, which I experienced one time, and sat in the airplane for 10 and a half hours, going from Bradley to Nordholz, Germany. After that, restricted all deployments to no more than 8 hours. So we always, going to Europe in the A-10, would stop either in Keflavik, Iceland, or Azores. So we could, in the fast movers, F-16s, F-15s, they could obviously get there in less than 8 hours all the way to Europe. The A-10 being a 300-knot airplane as opposed to a 450-knot airplane wouldn't make it under that time criteria. So, yeah, I've deployed over the ocean, both oceans, multiple times. And actually, as they got more senior, you give those kind of trips to the young guys. They need the time. They got.
But how did you? I meant to ask. How did you progress in your rank when you would come back from your Thailand, Vietnam?
I was a captain. Coming out of the Air Force, came into the Guard as a captain. Actually, there was a lot of promotion opportunities in the Guard in our unit, at least. We had a fairly young leadership, and so I made it in minimum time to major, and actually lieutenant colonel, because I was in a full-time role. So a lot of times they'll give the full-timers the leadership roles because they had the time to do it. If we had part-timers want to put the extra time in, they might get it, but they had to be able to commit more time if they wanted to be in a leadership role. So with that came rank. So I actually made lieutenant colonel and probably major in 9 or 10 years, and lieutenant colonel in less than 14, which was as fast as you can get there. And then I sat there for quite a while. And they assigned they changed our structure in the wings in the Guard units. And in the early 90s, 92, they came up with some extra colonel slots. And at that point, in 93, I was pinned to colonel, full colonel. stayed in that rank all the way to 99.
And you were still in Connecticut at that point?
At that point, to cap off the career, I was in Connecticut during the 90s. Starting in '93, we were deployed to Aviano for the Balkans. We were deployed to Kuwait for Southern Watch after Desert Storm. So there was a lot of activity. And the Guard, because we were total force, ready reserve, we were included in it, coming out of Desert Storm. So that we'd done all those other training deployments. These were operational deployments, and they included the Guard and reserve in those deployments. So it proved the system of total force. We were ready to go in a moment's notice, and these were all pre-scheduled because we were doing basically no-fly zones in either Bosnia or southern Iraq, in our case out of Kuwait, and northern Iraq out of Turkey. So the Air Force was really busy during the 90s, and we were an integral part of that. So I deployed twice to Aviano for the Balkans, once to Kuwait for Iraq.
Would you go for how many months at a time typically?
The deployment to Aviano was 2 months, and we would relieve the A-10 unit out of Spangdahlem for 2 months, and they would do 2 months. A reserve guard unit would do 2 months, and we went through that cycle for about 2.5 years. And the CENTCOM wanted us to come and help out with the Southern Watch, but they wanted us to be there for 6 months. So we basically said, well, we'll just stick with USAFE and go to Aviano. Well, that ended. That all air support, 97. So from then on, we basically negotiated for a 3-month cycle, and that became kind of the standard for a while in the Air Force. The Guard and Reserve would take over Kuwait for 3 months at a time. So, and then after that, the Air Force got into that cycle, so it became a 3-month cycle. Everybody was cycling through in 3 months at a time. And that's doable because you can study it's a no-fly zone. You can study the intel reports, know what the threats are, and that kind of stuff at home. And it's unlike on the ground. You got to kind of know who you're working with. The Army never did want to go to that shorter cycle. The Navy's always had a 6-month cycle with the Marines, and then the Army had a 1 year in theater cycle for a while. And they've modified that somewhat for the Guard subsequently. But different environment.
And you were still flying the A-10 when you were
still flying the A-10 the whole time. And during that period in 1997, I left Connecticut. I actually had an opportunity to go down to Pennsylvania and take over a wing that was having some problems, and it was an opportunity to look good, and my troops made me look good. And from that, because just good fortune and timing, I was certainly looking all during that period at retiring, looking for a flying job in the civilian community or something in the 90s, and certainly thought that was my lot in life, coming out of the Guard. But because people at Willow Grove, 111 Fighter Wing, made me look so good, the leadership of Pennsylvania hired me up in the headquarters, which in the Guard is a state political job, state job. So another full-time job, another kind of career in headquarters. And of course, the rank that came with that was made a star in '99 and 2 stars in 2001, which was a big Guard in Pennsylvania. So it was a 2-star billet for commander of the Air Guard. So
and then you
did that for 6 years, 6 more years up until the end of 2006 from '99.
And then you retired.
And I finally retired. I mean, I ran up against a statutory limit age, which at the time was 62 for somebody of that rank in that position.
Were you still flying when you were a general at that point? Or?
Yeah, they finally budgets got a lot tighter. I mean, back when I was just flying the A-10, general can go up, do anything you want, to go to the range, do whatever we were doing. I mean, he wouldn't be mission ready because we couldn't take a general to war, but the flying programs became a lot tighter. So you couldn't fly a fighter unless you just wanted to be a rider in the back seat. And of course, the only fighters we had in Pennsylvania were single seat, the A-10, so that wasn't possible. So I checked out in C-130, EC-130, which was a psychological operations mission at Harrisburg, and I could sit in the left seat and had an instructor in the right seat. So he was my CNI pilot, and so I just had to take it off, land it. And the flight engineer and the co-pilot did all the hard stuff. So I wasn't a mission ready pilot, but it was called it was called an observation pilot, OP time. I called it other pilots' time.
But you were still able to.
Yes, I could still go fly, and that was a mission. That was a special ops mission. So it was of great interest to me. I knew kind of what tankers did. We had a tanker unit, we had a fighter unit, we had a special ops unit. I didn't know what they did necessarily, what special ops was really involved with. So by flying with them, I was able to see their mission. I was able to get down to Air Force Special Operations Command headquarters, see some of the other stuff they did. You know, they put in SEALs, Green Berets, Special Forces, how the Air Force supported that. So that was it was a very effective way for me to kind of understand their mission and keep flying.
Sure.
And actually, I'm still flying. I fly for the Civil Air Patrol.
So do you? It never gets out of your blood.
No, it's always been in my blood.
Not something you would have guessed as growing up on a farm.
No, I had no clue what airplanes were.
Do you have any other general memories or thoughts about your years in the service? How it formed you as a person, I guess?
Well, I think the biggest evolution in the service, other than going from the draft military to the volunteer military, was the joint military. And that was something after the Iranian rescue attempt that completely fell apart because we couldn't operate jointly. And then followed by Grenada and some of the other things. We didn't have common radios and that kind of stuff, to Goldwater-Nichols legislation that said you will operate jointly, to a position now where I couldn't even make general at this time because I didn't, without a joint billet. And so now, and there's opportunities for those billets. There weren't any opportunities for guard generals to get in those billets or colonels at the time, but there are now those opportunities in the total force. And you got to go over into a theater or some operation and be able to operate and talk common language, which is a joint language with Navy, Army, Air Force. And so I would say that's the biggest experience I had. And one of the service that pushed back on that the most was the Navy. It was always the case. In fact, when they were testifying before Congress, when they were trying to implement this Goldwater-Nichols, it was Senator Goldwater and Representative Nichols from Alabama. And it was one was a Democrat, one was a Republican, but House of Representatives and the Senate was intent on getting it done, in spite of anybody in the military. And really, with the Army and Air Force, we were fine with it. Actually, they were one service at one time, so maybe that helped. But the Navy really pushed back, and I always contended that it's probably because they already had their ground forces, their Marines, and they already did their Air Force, their carrier groups. So probably they said we don't need. And the Libyan thing in the 80s, they kind of took care on their own without any help. And we can put an air base anywhere, or Marines anywhere on a boat, one of the 7 Seas, so we don't need no stinking Army or Air Force. We can do it ourselves. And they actually threw the CNO out of the hearing. I can't remember what his name was, but so that all evolved. And they said, no, we're going to do it. So you will do it, Navy. And so they get the Desert Storm, and the Air Component Commander, General Horner, and this is fairly well known and has been written up by I've read a number of articles. When that came time to fight the air war, the Navy came over to the meeting and said, well, we can't take the air tasking order because we don't have the computer systems, the electronics to do it, because they just hadn't bought into this. And when they formed CENTCOM, which fought the Desert Storm War, the Navy, for the organizational meetings, sent a captain or colonel in Army or Air Force rank system, and the Air Force and Army sent their 3 stars, appropriate 3 stars, the ground component commander, the air component commander, to the meeting. So you knew the Navy was still buying into this. So Horner told the Navy, he said, well, if you can't take the air tasking order, you can just sit on your carriers and we'll take care of it ourselves. And we had the capability to do that. I mean, nobody was real sure about how formidable Saddam Hussein's Army and Air Force was, but we kind of guessed it wasn't that formidable, and it wasn't. So, and he called their bluff. He said, no, okay, fine. And so the captain went back to the ship and told the 3-star admiral, hey, they're not going to let us play. And what the Navy wanted to do is what we did in Vietnam, divide up the airspace. We'll take a certain amount of airspace, you take the other airspace. And during that period, we were always nose to nose with them in these assigned areas, and you never knew whether it was a MiG or a Navy guy. And that's the problem with not having a coordinated effort, especially in the air. And so finally, the Navy consented to fly one of these small radar airplanes into Riyadh every night and pick up the air tasking order, the hard copy, and take it back to the ships. And they had 2 carrier groups, one in the Persian Gulf, one in the Mediterranean. So they did play, but they had to do it. So they finally got on board after that. And now that's a huge evolution, I think, in the military, the joint piece of it.
You've been fortunate to have seen an evolution in your own life as well as the military
Right.
over a long period of time. So,
well, in the military today, I mean, you can't beat the capability, and it's because of the soldiers and the airmen, the Navy enlisted Corps. I mean, they've all seen action. I mean, we've been at war basically for 20 years since Desert Storm, pretty consistently. In the Army, it'll be interesting to see how the Army and Navy now treats their reserve component. There's always political wrangling for money between those components, even in the Air Force still. But I think the Air Force, to their credit, bought into the total force, because by saving money with your personnel costs, because that's what the reserves save you, you can buy more stuff and more capability. And that reserve component has a lot of capability that's been, expensively bought. And most of the people in reserves have served on active duty. They can be very beneficial, and they do it at a lot lower cost. So it'll be interesting to see how that evolves in these tight budget times. And I certainly would be a proponent of saying you put more into the Guard and Reserve, but you got to have a strong active duty component as well. They're the stability you got to build it on. They do all the R&D, all the stuff to develop the systems that you can put in the reserves. So that I don't what that ratio is hard to tell at any given time. But
was there anything else you can think of that you'd like to add to your interview before we wrap it up?
Well, it's just thoroughly enjoyed being in the military. Obviously, it started out with flying, but all these other positions I've been in, I mean, it all comes back to the people you work with. I mean, you got people that are dedicated to the country, and they sign up in uniform. And the people we got now, I mean, they don't have to now. I mean, back in the '60s, Vietnam, prior to, I mean, it was a way to enlist to make sure you didn't necessarily go through the draft. If you wanted to either stay out of the Army, maybe, or out of the foxhole. So it's always better to be in a vehicle that you can retreat at 500 knots, I guess, than being in a foxhole. You can only retreat so fast. So it's, but the people are great. I mean, it's been a lot of fun. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I still stay in contact with the Guard as much as I can in retirement. Still work a little bit with the military department here in Connecticut.
Do you ever have friends from back in your first years in the service that you get together with, the original Thailand group?
We don't. The way we went through Vietnam was that it wasn't. I think, Joe, you talked about going over as a unit. We didn't. So you turn over the whole unit in that year. So you might not know. There's nobody there. The guys you come in with, you might be there the whole year, but for the most part, you're there with nobody more than 6 months. And I can't. There's not been any reunions of those people now. In the Guard, we do all that. We get together with people in the Guard. I serve with in Connecticut. There's events down in Pennsylvania I go back to. So I do that with the Guard. I've gotten invitations back to my college last couple of years. So I've gone back to a couple of those. And I hadn't seen some of those people in 25, 30 years. and from those engagements, I've found people in Connecticut here that renewed acquaintances with. But I can't say the Vietnam or even the F-100 has a Super Saber Society, and I've never gone to one of their events, but I've come close a couple times. I'll probably eventually go to one of those, and I'll probably renew some acquaintances from Europe and that. And then, of course, that's Guard guys that flew the 100 as well, plus the guys that I might have flown with on active duty. And some of the leaders of that association were guys I was stationed with over in Europe. But I haven't so far gone back to one of their reunions yet. But probably won't.
Still many years to go.
Yeah. But I stay involved with the museum up at New England Air Museum and some of these other things. I mean, if you're in the military, like we talked about, you're part of history now. Unfortunately for us, we're
still living history.
We're the living history. I guess that's why we're doing this.
Well, I appreciate the interview, and on a personal note, I'd like to thank you for your service.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate your interest in the interest of Connecticut University.
Thank you again.